ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
G'day, I'm Erin Park, host of the new podcast series Expanse, Nowhere Man. It's 1999 and a young American man's disappeared into the Great Sandy Desert on a mysterious personal quest. He's been missing a month and most people think he's dead. But can an American search team save the day? From cigar-smoking Americans to booty-wearing bloodhounds, this story just keeps getting stranger.
I just thought this looks like a cartoon.
Once you're done with News Daily, search Expanse on the ABC Listen app.
Will Australia join a US war against China if it invades Taiwan? That's the stark question Anthony Albanese faced during his delicate visit to Beijing, where he's trying to strengthen trade and business ties. So, with the Prime Minister meeting the Chinese President, can he drum up more business while managing tensions in the relationship? Today, the ABC's newly appointed Global Affairs Editor, Laura Tingle, joins us from Beijing. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Laura, Anthony Albanese and President Xi, they're two leaders that have a lot to talk about, to say the least, aren't they?
They do have a lot to talk about, Sam.
The Prime Minister is sitting down with China's president in Beijing in a high-profile meeting being closely watched in Canberra and Washington.
Australia values our relationship with China and will continue to approach it in a calm and consistent manner. It's important we have these direct discussions on issues that matter to us and to the stability and prosperity of our region.
With joint efforts from both sides, the China-Australia relationship has rose from the setback and turned around.
There are all the sort of cliches about relationships and all those sorts of things, but it's interesting to me to come back to China on a prime ministerial trip after a bit of a break because it does feel very much like the trips of the 80s and 90s where it was all, love and kisses and opportunities, which, given that there are points of significant difference between the two sides, is interesting.
Well, Laura, the Prime Minister did speak after the meeting. He says he raised the detention of the Australian writer Yang Hengjun with the Chinese president. But overall, he was really positive about the economic relationship that Australia has with China right now.
We had a very constructive meeting with President Xi in which we spoke about the range of issues facing our relationship with China. My government's approach to our relationship with China is patient, is calibrated and is deliberate.
And not to mention, of course, Donald Trump. He's ever present, isn't he? And his tariffs.
Absolutely. He's ever present, and just in the last 24 hours we've had yet another announcement from Donald Trump, of course, about the possibility of really tough tariffs on Russia over Ukraine if Vladimir Putin doesn't do as he should, according to Donald Trump, and he's threatening secondary sanctions on China, or he hasn't named China, but on countries that have strong trading relationships with Russia, which would certainly hit China as its biggest trading partner. So it affects everything that's going on here in Beijing at the moment. The world is being rewired before our eyes, I think, Sam.
Well, we know, of course, that trade and business are crucial items for Anthony Albanese during this trip.
And given that China is overwhelmingly, by far, the largest trading partner that Australia has, it is very much in the interests of Australian jobs and the Australian economy to have a positive and constructive relationship with China.
But the thing is, Laura, we've seen before that this relationship with China is so delicate that it can fall apart in a nanosecond. We saw that, didn't we, with Scott Morrison when he called for an inquiry into COVID. Trade was just cut by Beijing. So why are we trying to build it up when we know that it can fall apart so easily?
Well, it can fall apart around the edges, but realistically, we still have this massive trade relationship with China. That's the reality of it. They've cut us off on some particular markets in the past few years, but it's still 25% of our exports go to China. So that relationship is really solid. China, for the time being, certainly, or for the next little while, is reliant on our iron ore. So while you have these disruptions and things, it's still a fundamental relationship. Now, it is extraordinary to just think about how bad things did get a few years ago, where basically no minister could get a phone call from anybody in China. They were throwing Australian journalists out of the country and jailing others. It was pretty ugly.
An Australian journalist working in China has been detained by the Chinese government in a highly sensitive case, posing a fresh challenge to those already fraught Australia-China relations.
First it was barley, now it's beef. Our largest trading partner suspending imports from 4 abattoirs.
Beyond meat, China is now refusing to accept timber from 4 states. Lobsters are shut out. Wine exporters face a up to 200% tariff.
I think there's been a bit of a change at the Chinese end. I think the whole culture of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy was something that they ultimately decided wasn't really working in their interests. And I think, once again, to mention Donald Trump, you can see, I think, that not just in their relationship with Australia, but in their relationship with countries like Vietnam, China is really pushing this message that, we're the safe and steady, people who make, very sensible, rational, calm decisions about our trade relationships. China's playing the sort of adult in the room role, if you like.
Well, Laura, of course, trade is one thing, but then there is the flip side to this relationship, and that is security, of course, and the elephant, if you like, in the room, which is Taiwan. And that is when things get really complicated, don't they, for Anthony Albanese?
Well, they do and they don't get complicated in some way, Sam. If you think about sort of the domestic way this issue has to play out at some point, and also then how it plays out on the international stage. Now, a story was leaked over the weekend, just as the Prime Minister was arriving in Shanghai, about how the Under Secretary of Defence, Elbridge Colby, was pushing Australia and Japan to say exactly what their position would be in the case of a war with Taiwan. On one level, that's sort of a bit embarrassing for the Prime Minister, but he's made it clear that, we make our own decisions about these things.
Do you think it's important, from the point of view of deterrence of China, that you say, yes, we're involved, or no, we're not involved?
I think it's important that we have a consistent position, which Australia has had for a long period of time. We support the status quo when it comes to Taiwan. We don't support any unilateral action.
And it was being linked to the AUKUS submarines, the Virginia-class submarines that we're supposed to be getting from the Americans. Now, it's quite clear, talking to Australian officials, that they don't regard the AUKUS deal as in any way gives the Americans any right to tell us what we would do with the US submarines once we got them, because they'd be ours. We'd buy them. Now, there seems to be a fair degree of confidence that despite these stories, that will all sort of settle down. And I sort of also think you've got to back engineer this a little bit. I mean, if you took Elbridge Colby's comments seriously and said, he's saying that we can't get the submarines unless we're prepared to go to war with Taiwan. Well, wait a minute. The Americans haven't said that they would go to war with China over Taiwan. It sort of doesn't all quite stack up.
There was some confusion, wasn't there, when Joe Biden was president, over some questioning on this, whether the US would support Taiwan militarily.
Yes.
That was never really cleared up, but he came pretty close to saying they would.
He certainly did come close to saying that they would. Donald Trump certainly hasn't.
What do you think, though, Laura? Is the Trump administration justified in asking this question, asking nations if they would support the US if China did invade Taiwan? China has continually been flexing its muscles, hasn't it? Military exercises around the Pacific, including almost all the way around Australia. So there's reason for concern. There's reason for discussions like this.
Absolutely. There's a really legitimate reason for discussions. And I think it's really important that Australia has that discussion internally, because I don't think we've been having it until now. And it affects those decisions about whether we have a forward strategic stance in the South China Sea or not. But I think the crucial question is, it's fine for the Americans to ask that question if their own position is clarified. And I think this is the dodgy bit of it, to use the technical phrase. I mean, I think the Americans don't want to say what their position is, and it's not clear that they would, go to war over Taiwan with China.
Would it be reasonable for the United States to demand any sort of assurances from Australia on a Taiwan contingency, given the United States itself maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity, at least in theory, on Taiwan?
Well, you've just answered the question yourself, I think, through the comments that you've made.
Well, Laura, just sum this up for me. How successful do you think the Prime Minister's approach to China will be? Because it is remarkably different, isn't it, to the way that Scott Morrison, for instance, dealt with Beijing, or Donald Trump for that matter?
Well, you'd have to say at this stage it's certainly more successful, Sam, just because we have restored those trade links. He's here. This is another visit. As you say, it's always volatile, but for now it's quite a good relationship, and it serves both countries well in the context of this global trade war that Donald Trump has started. So I think, it's a good basis to be operating in this very uncertain world.
But Laura, what about tensions in the relationship? What do you think? Will Anthony Albanese actually tackle those head on, or is he going to bring some sort of softer approach for fear of backlash from China?
Look, well, I suppose there are two observations on that. One of them is Penny Wong has, in the last week, gone out very hard on these issues, both in a speech and also in her meetings with her counterpart when she was at the ASEAN meeting.
China continues to assert its strategic influence and project its military power further into our region. And we have seen the worrying pace of China's nuclear and conventional military build-up without the transparency that the region expects. We are realistic about China's objectives in changing the regional balance of power.
So she's laid down Australia's protests on all these issues in a very forthright way. And the Prime Minister has said that, these issues will not be avoided in his conversations with the President and Premier while he's here in Beijing. But, it's always the case that those leader-to-leader meetings, they're a little bit more diplomatic about what they might say publicly. But Anthony Albanese says that, one, he's on the case, and two, that it's been successful in the interest of Australia since he's been Prime Minister.
All right. Well, Laura, it's a true balancing act, that's for sure. The PM's trying to work with China, but he also wants to keep the US happy too. So this, I think, is one of the most complicated relationships he has to deal with as the leader of Australia, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I can't help but feeling that the way that the Trump administration has been behaving, if you like, in that broader description of its sort of erraticness and everything, has created both political space at home and abroad for, the Prime Minister to establish a more assertive position with both major powers, sort of establish that more independent voice of our own. I think it's been quite useful because I think people at home are they look at what Donald Trump's been doing with a bit of confusion and concern, and it's just given him some space. And of course also, 3 years ago there was this sense that the Labor Party couldn't say anything negative about the United States at all or about the alliance because they'd get absolutely pummeled by the coalition. It's harder to do that now because of the way the US has been going, but also, of course, the coalition is weakened politically, and it's both its capacity and its taste for, fighting every last fight as a sign of, being disloyal to the Americans has really subsided. So I think there's a lot of tectonic plate shifting, which give government of the day room to manoeuvre with both major powers.
Laura Tingle is the ABC's Global Affairs Editor. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.